Right, so we've got everything out of our transmission case. What I'm going to do now is start by rotating my case, and I'm going to install my oil seals. Then I'm going to go over all of my gasket surfaces, wipe them down with some alcohol wipes, just to get the last traces of any oil off of those gasket surfaces. When I'm installing my oil seals, I want to lubricate them with a small amount of silicone grease on both the outside and the inside lips of the seals. And you don't need to have this really swimming, and we'll wipe off any extra once we've tapped in that seal. So I want to recess this seal very slightly, just so when we put our stub axle in, it doesn't rub against that seal. That should be good right there. Okay, looks good. So we're going to install our oil breather. This one is very specific in where it needs to be installed and the angle that it needs to be installed. So what we're looking for is, if we imagine this is transmission, using this parting line here, we want to be at a 45-degree angle. So let's look and see what happens if we installed it the wrong way. So this is where it sits inside the transmission case at the correct angle. If we turned this, for example, and had it sitting this direction, what's going to happen is this crown wheel is rotating right here, is going to act like a pump. And it is going to force all of the, well, not all of it, but a large portion of the transmission oil up this pipe and cause it to spray out the breather. So it's very important that it is facing towards the selector shaft of the transmission and on approximately a 45-degree angle once it's installed. We're going to apply a little bit of our Loctite case sealer to the threads, and we do not need a lot. Just like that. Now this is a tapered thread, so it doesn't need a lot of tension. And right about there at 45 degrees. If we check it on the inside of our case, the pipe is angled so the cutout is facing into this corner. So the likelihood of oil being pumped up into that breather is fairly low. So I'm going to prep my gasket surfaces next, and we've had our transmission in and out a bunch of times, so there's going to be very thin trace amounts of oil. So I'm just using an alcohol wipe so I can go and clean all of my gasket surfaces. I want them clean and dry. Also gives me another chance to have a last look over everything, feeling it with my thumb, make sure there's no nicks or burrs or anything that's going to create a leak. See, we're getting a little bit of oil coming off of everything. Okay, I want to do the same on my intermediate case or intermediate housing. As well as our differential housing as well. Okay. I want to prep my selector shaft, and this area right here is usually where we end up with some burrs, usually right around where our actual shift coupling goes. So I'm just using a little bit of Scotch-Brite just to polish that shaft up, make sure it's all nice and smooth. This area is where the oil seal will run, so we want to make sure that there's nothing there that can damage our selector shaft seal that could create an oil leak. Also, we want to make sure when I install it that this is nice and smooth and there's no burrs here that could damage our selector shaft seal as well. So it's actually not feeling too bad. Same up here, we just want to look, we'll give this a quick squirt with some brake clean just to get rid of this leftover oil debris. Now we are all clean and ready for reassembly. I'm going to start with my intermediate assembly first. So put our gasket back on. Because we're doing final assembly and all of our gear shafts are assembled, I'm just going to put some light coats of gear oil onto our bearings. And I still have our fifth gear selected. The next thing I need to do is I need to thread in my selector shaft, and this is going to just poke through that little hole in there, and we want to just lay it in. This all has to go in as one assembly because this has to locate into the front of the case, and then there's a little fork assembly which holds this pivot. Doesn't matter if it comes out of here while we're installing because we can reach in through the access hole to fix it. It's a little bit of a juggling act at first. So our selector rod will fit into this little hole right here that's going to support the front of it. And then I just want to kind of reach in and make sure that the lever that's in here is kind of sort of in the right place. As I said, we've got a little bit of latitude with this. Okay, so we can look at our oil seal here, make sure it's running in the polished area, which it is. Everything's turning very nicely. We've got our selector roughly in the right place. All right, so right now we are still in fifth gear, and I've got my selector sitting in that fifth gear selector fork down in there. So what I'm going to do is take my little pry bar and just push it in here, pull it into neutral. So now my selector fork can move through our normal selection range. And we have to have our selector in neutral to be able to get our pivot fork, which is this piece, in. Our pivot fork has to come in on an angle and hook underneath, but I'm going to put our gasket on here first. So our gasket is going to go on first. We're in that neutral position, so we can see our shift selector can move. It's going to drop this in so it hooks and push it down till it seats. And then 2 wave washers, and I've got new nuts. I don't reuse any hardware, there's no point plating it. Usually the hardware is kind of beat up anyways, and it's cheaper and more cost efficient just to use brand new hardware. Tightening torque on these is going to be 25 Newton meters. So I just put on some temporary nuts and spacers just so I could pry the transmission out of 5th gear. Otherwise, when you pry on that selector fork, it would have pushed the intermediate plate out. So I'm going to pull those off again. Okay, so I'm just going to prep our back case ready for assembly onto the transmission. We've got some oil splatters on here. A couple of areas you want to pay attention to on this. It is quite common to have this thread damaged in here, so I need to have a good look at that before I attempt to put the back case on. Also, I need to deburr in here for when I put the oil seal on. That's also a common problem where it can be a really sharp edge and damage that seal and result in a leak. Okay, usually with this seal, I want to just push it in with my thumbs. Very rarely do I need to drive it in. That's why I pay particular attention to deburring the edges, makes it easier to slide in. Also, it runs the risk if you try and hammer it in of damaging it. So next we want to assemble is our reverse idler. And we've got a series of needle roller bearings that are going to slide on with a spacer, followed by our other needle roller bearing. Then our reverse idler is going to slide on like that. These are our Torrington bearing or a needle roller bearing, followed by our thrust washer. Now the thrust washer has a little cutout right here. This cutout, when we assemble the case, has to sit like that. Otherwise we are not going to be able to get everything installed. So a little bit of a juggling act. Okay, so we've got our back plate gasket on. Let's do a final wipe with our alcohol. Then what we want to do is just carefully engage our shift. Oh. So what I normally do here is, because we've got to kind of roll it to one side slightly to clear the gear, and then I'll just bring up our thrust washer. So what I had to do was bring our gear forward slightly just to clear everything so I could engage it with our main shaft. And then before I slide everything in, I want to slide that thrust washer all the way down so I know that it's correctly indexed against the bearing. And we should be able to push our case in fairly easily. Shouldn't be too much movement there. And now we're ready to start putting our wave washers and nuts on. So for right now, I have left this nut off. This is where our ground strap's going to go, and since we don't have that right this second, I'm going to leave that one off. Tightening torque is 25 Newton meters. So we'll make sure everything turns nicely. We can see a pinion shaft. It's just rotating right now. Right now we're not in gear, so if I hold the pinion shaft, I can still turn the input shaft and it'll move freely. Okay, before I go any further, I want to check all of my gears, make sure everything is engaging and disengaging correctly, and I don't have any funny noises. So this is just a T-handle that allows me to come in and select my gears. And what I'm looking for is just different ratios as we move forward. First gear, we can see it's going the opposite direction. Second. Okay, you want to make sure when you drop the diff in that you don't drop it onto the pinion. You want to just let it in there nice and gently. Just want to keep rotating the differential, or I'm using the input shaft. I've just put the transmission into gear. Just want to make sure there's no tight spots. I know we've gone through and done all of our dummy assemblies, but still one last final check. When I install my stubs for the first time, when I push them down, what I want to make sure is that we have our oil seal seated correctly. So I should be able to see a gap between the oil seal and the actual stub axle. If it's not installed deep enough, what will happen is it'll actually rub and cause a leak. Alright, so when it comes to installing the stretch bolt that hold the flange on, we have to install our thrust washer first. The oil slot faces the axle, and it's got a little D shape to that thrust washer. So we just want to make sure we rotate that till that D shape locates in. Then on these, I want to put a little bit of oil on the head of the bolt and the threads. Need to lock the drive shaft. .45 Newton meters. Good. Clearance. Thrust washer. So in our drive shafts, Porsche uses this aluminum disc to stop oil because this is exposed to diff oil coming through that bolt area. One thing that does not come in a gasket set is the O-ring. So whenever you're doing this job, you need to order the O-ring seals for these separately. And they're just going to slide on there, same thing, we're going to lubricate and then push those in to seal. Okay, so when I push it in, there's a little groove right here, and that's what it typically gets hung up on. So I had to kind of wiggle it around. Then lastly, we have these little spring clips that go in and lock into that groove. And that spring clip is what holds that plate in. Once I'm in, what I normally want to do is just rotate it to make sure it's located in that groove. Alright, so I'm going to install my drain plug, and these are a tapered plug, has a magnet on the bottom. I've cleaned all the magnet off. These are one of the most over-torqued items in a transmission. They are a tapered thread, and the tightening torque is only going to be 25 Newton meters. I've seen a lot of people tighten these because they undo them and the thing takes 50 or 60 foot-pounds to undo it. They think it's got to go that tight again. But they really do not have to be very tight at all. There's also no thread sealer required or anything on these. That's it. I'm going to leave this one. I'm just going to start it, but because we don't have oil in the transmission yet, I'm not going to tighten it up. This is going to be the same tightening torque. We'll tighten it up in just a minute. I'm going to install our throttle pivot, and I'm just going to put a little tiny bit of blue Loctite. And I'm just going to screw it down till it stops. Wipe off our excess. Then here's our throttle pivot. So this is going to connect to the vehicle. When we accelerate or push the gas pedal, it's going to pull down, which is going to pull the transfer rod. There's already new bushings in that. They're nylon bushings. Okay. Right here, this is where our backup light switch goes. We're going to use this small pin, and this pin is going to drop down in there. Now when we go into reverse, if I can make it work the first time, see how that pin popped up? What that pin does is as it pops up, it presses on our contact right here for our backup light switch. When we come back into neutral or any of the other gears, the pin goes back down. These pins do wear, so what we're going to do, screw in our backup light switch and tighten it. And these come with a new aluminum crush washer. Then we're going to grab our voltmeter and make sure the switch is working. I've just started up my voltmeter, selected ohms. I'm going to check my cables. We should have continuity, so we do, 0, 0. So right now we are out of gear and we have open circuit.
For a second.
Yeah, no, we have continuity now. So I'm in reverse and we see we have 0.1 of an ohm across the switch. And when I pop it back into neutral, should go open circuit again. So I'm going to go back into gear. There we are in reverse, and now we have actually a perfect connection, 0.1, 2.0, pretty much perfect across the switch. So the backup light switch is working, the rod is the correct length, it's not overly worn, and it's activating that switch. All right, now we're just going to install our release bearing guide sleeve. That's just going to sit on there, 2 M10 nuts, going to hold that on. Okay, the tightening torque on these is going to be 8 to 10 Newton meters. Okay, we'll install our clutch release bearing and fork in just a moment, once I roll the transmission over, but right now I want to install my adapter for my speedometer drive. So this is our adapter. What this does is this will slide into the case. It changes the speedometer drive angle, and this drives directly off the brass gear on the back of the pinion shaft, and then this is another 90-degree adapter which will go to our speedometer cable. These are the most common failure points in these transmissions for speedometer drive. If you've got a speedometer that needle bounces a lot when you drive, it's either going to be the cable or this 90-degree drive assembly. It's a very common failure point. Down inside here we have a seal and a sealing washer. We need to very carefully pop this out so we can replace that oil seal. This is also a common spot for leaks. It's usually overlooked, so a lot of people don't realize there's a seal down in there, and then what will happen is you'll have oil leaking through this unit and kind of everywhere. So I have the seal and the retaining plate out of our brass piece. You can see what's left of the seal when it came out. This is just not a fun job, and doing it without damaging it is a real challenge. What I ended up doing was putting it in my lathe to gently support it, because I didn't want to put jaw marks right here, and worked at it and pulled it and was able to get the metal piece out first and then carefully pry out the seal. I still had to go and rechase the threads just because they had a little bit of damage from all the tools I had in there, but now everything screws back together nice and smooth, and we've got everything disassembled. So I need to install the new seal, which is going to drop down in, and then I'm going to hammer in the thrust surface, and then we can go ahead and install this part into the transmission. Okay, I'm just using a little screwdriver so I can get my silicone grease to the inside of the seal. And it's a little bit hard working down in the hole here. I'm trying to see if I can get it started with my fingers first, but it just wants to keep pushing out, so I'll probably have to use a small socket. Okay, so I've got my seal pressed down. I need to seat it a little bit further before I put the thrust surface back in. So when it comes to our thrust surface is actually an interference fit with the brass. There's a little machined lip area for it, so I want to just line that up. Tap that down in there like that, and that's actually is what's going to hold that seal in place. Now when I screw our angle drive, that's actually gonna, when I finally crank down, if it's not seated all the way, this will actually finish that seating. I need to put my O-ring here. I need to slide our drive gear back in carefully. Just let it come through that seal. Just like that. And I'm just going to put our 90-degree drive on just so I can put it in and line up our locating hole. Okay, so when it comes to tightening the speedometer drive, best way I've found to do it is hold it in a chuck on the lathe, and we want our locator right here, our speedometer drive pointing back. Nip it down, doesn't have to be super tight. And now we can go install it into the transmission. Okay, there's my O-ring on. Going to lubricate it with silicone grease again, and then we're ready to install. So what we want to do when we install this is we need to line this hole up with the bolt hole right there. So I just want to get my O-ring in, started. Okay, and then our bolt goes in. We don't need any sealant or any washers on this. And we just want to lightly seat that. So the last piece of hardware I have to install is going to be our clutch release bearing pivot fork pivot bowl. It's going to have a copper washer that's going to sit onto here. The other thing I always like to do with these is a little bit of either Loctite 518 or 574, more so as a oil control than an actual Loctite for the stud falling out. So I'm going to screw that in and just grab a socket, tighten that. Okay, it's tightened down. One of the last things I need to do for my transmission is put my clutch release bearing in. These little plastic supports just slide onto that release bearing. Then, using a little bit of just wheel bearing grease, I want to lubricate inside the release bearing. There is a groove right here that is designed to hold that grease. And then I just want on my contact points right here. This is going to slide into the clutch fork. Just like that. And a little bit of grease in the ball socket. We're ready to install. Okay, so I'm just going to slide that fork in, pivot that release bearing, line it up, and push the ball socket in. To hold the clutch fork on, it's got a little metal bracket that slides in from the back and a little Allen headed bolt that we tighten up. So I'm just going to reach in around, and this is a little bit of a balancing act to line everything up. Okay, this is just torqued to 8 to 10 Newton meters, and that's it. Just making sure my clutch release bearing slides smoothly, which it does. Wipe off that excess grease and we're done in here. Right, so the last thing I'm going to do on my transmission is fill it with oil. So what I've done is I've rotated my transmission until it is level. That's very important. We had left the fill plug loose. I'm going to use an 80W90 GL4 spec oil. Put it in here, and I'm just going to pump it. And where I want my oil level is either just slightly coming out on the threads or just slightly below the fill plug area.
Is this like engine oil after a rebuild? Do you need to change it?
No. This, the first change, you're going to be looking at usually around 25,000 miles. Close. Still a long ways down, still down around here. Nope. Fill your transmission slowly so you don't overfill. And the other thing that I do is I put my little pinky finger in, there's plenty of room, come straight down, and I just kind of fold it down a little bit and bring it up. And then we can see I have plenty of gear oil, so I know my level is right about here, which is just plenty. I'm going to go and put my fill plug back in now. The fill plugs on these are the same as the drain plug. They are a tapered plug. Be careful, do not over tighten them. And we are going to do our torque at 25 Newton meters on this plug as well. Oh yeah, can feel the oil getting everywhere. So one of the last things that I'm doing right now, just because I know this transmission is going to be sitting for a while, is I want to just work the differential to turn the entire gear sets. You do not have to be in a gear to do this. I just want to work that oil through all of my different areas inside the transmission, because as you remember, everything was pretty much clean and dry when it was assembled. And you can really feel that oil working. Granted, it's like 60 degrees in the shop, so it's pretty thick in there. But I can hear it just getting so much quieter as that oil gets everywhere. It's going to work it through our sun gears. Feel our front input shaft. And that's it. Well, this finishes up our 902 transmission rebuild. I'd like to say thanks for watching. It's been a long series with a lot of stuff going on. If you guys have questions or something that didn't quite gel, feel free to send us a message in the comment section. Also, if you liked this series, we'd ask you to hit the like and the subscribe button. It helps us out in YouTube's search, and it also lets us know what people out there are liking. And once again, thanks for watching.